Okay, life can be crazy. You're feeling like you're sinking, just trying to find a meaning. It's time for better thinking. Yeah, better thinking. Time to tune in. Let's go.
Welcome back to Better Thinking. My name's Nesh Nikolic, and my guest today is Rebecca Collie. Rebecca is an Associate Professor of Educational Psychology at the UNSW School of Education. She conducts research in the areas of motivation, wellbeing, and social emotional development using quantitative research methods. Her research also encompasses related factors such as adaptability, engagement, interpersonal relationships, and achievement. Rebecca examines predictors and outcomes of these different factors among children, youth, and adults in educational settings. And broadly speaking, her research aims to identify how to best support and promote social, emotional, academic, and occupational thriving among students and teachers. Rebecca has been awarded over $1 million in national and international grants and government and non-government research tenders. Her publications include 100 plus peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters, one co-edited book, along with 25 publications for professional audiences. Rebecca's research features regularly in print and online media, articles, and podcasts as well. She has delivered keynote presentations to academic, community, and educational organizations. And it's a great pleasure talking to Rebecca today about how we can promote and understand educational settings to help both teachers and students thrive. Rebecca, a big thank you for coming on to the podcast today.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
I'm really excited to find out more about this space of motivation, wellbeing, and social emotional development that you've been looking at in your research, particularly around students and the wellbeing of teachers. I think this is an area that doesn't get the attention that I think it deserves. We've got young people growing up trying to find their way through life in those early developmental years. We've got teachers that are doing an extraordinary job that are balancing and juggling lots of different demands. And so it's really nice to hear about what does the research say, and how can we be informed by that. So I like to often ask, how did you get into this space before we go into what all the findings are? Because I find that's an interesting question that, what drives someone to be interested in this space and then devote so much time, energy in their life into that?
Yeah, so I was a primary school teacher, and it was during that time that I became really aware of these social and emotional dimensions. And historically, we have focused more on the academic outcomes of students. Sure, in the early years of schooling, there's a lot of focus on social and emotional skills and learning how to work with others, but that tapers off as students move through school. And so, as a primary school teacher in the middle grades, I saw the critical role of these social emotional skills, not just for students' social adjustment, but also for their learning. If they weren't able to interact well with other students in collaborative work, for example, it really impacted their ability to learn from the content. And so that became really apparent to me. And at the same time, I saw just how critical teacher wellbeing was. I saw in the staff room that when we weren't feeling great, or we weren't switched on, perhaps we were sick, with a cold or something, it just really impacted how we taught. And so I became interested in these ideas then, and then started conducting research on it. And when I started conducting research on it, it was surprising now, but back then people said, teacher wellbeing, we shouldn't worry so much about that. We should only be focused on the students. But in my belief, if we want to have students to thrive, we actually have to have teachers that thrive as well. And so that's driven a lot of the research that I've done in this area.
I know with two little people in my life that the question around schooling and where to send them, and in actual fact when to start your child in which grade, because we've got one child that has been on the cusp and you can choose either direction. I've heard lots of research about holding a child back, particularly for those social reasons. And is this something that is quite well established and quite well understood, that there are obviously pros and cons in that. I won't probably ask you immediately about, what's the right way, because obviously it's about every individual child has different needs and it's a parental decision. But is there information out there, data that can inform us about the considerations we should think about in how to do, how to support our young people, and the decisions we should kind of keep in mind as a parent about our children in growing up? And I obviously want to switch across to hearing more about the teacher side, because I think you're on the money as well, about the importance and value of teachers. It's no different to the importance and value of parents. We need to support them because they are the foundation for kids, right?
Yeah, so look, it's a tricky one, that school age. You're right. It does come down to the individual child, the individual family. But there's research going both ways. Academically, research says after a few grades, the younger children catch up. So by the end of primary school, they're equal to students who started later. But in the social adjustment side of things, that the results can be more mixed. So I think it really does come down to what parents are comfortable with, what they think is best for their child, and they can also speak to the school and the teachers to better understand that. So it is a tricky space, and yes, as I said before, the social and emotional factors are critical when it comes to helping students progress through school and develop. And so making sure that you're happy with the school and the way that they provide that extra care or that pastoral care for students is an important decision as well. But it's a tricky one. I know lots of parents spend a lot of time wondering what's the best decision. So academically, it doesn't seem to matter from what I've read in terms of the research, but there can be different social outcomes depending on the child's needs. So that's that's the answer to that question. And then moving on to the teacher side, you mentioned about the demands, and we do know that the teaching profession has increased in complexity over the past decade, perhaps even the past 15 years. And so teachers have a lot more responsibility, a wider range of jobs as part of their professional requirements. And so it is really important that we do provide teachers with that support as well, particularly for different students within the classroom, so that they do have the capacity to support every student with their needs.
Has the role broadened in terms of what is now being expected from a classroom teacher, that they're being asked to provide more tailored care or education or support for young people? Where has that demand grown?
One big area that it's grown is in compliance and accountability. And so teachers are being asked to keep a lot more, paperwork, checking boxes, making sure everything is ticked and in the right place. And accountability is important, it's necessary. But what I think the problem is that the supports for teachers haven't kept pace with the increase in accountability and compliance. And so teachers are doing a lot more now with the same time than what they did 10 to 15 years ago.
And accountability meaning ensuring that certain processes have been done, or things have been completed, and that it's logged somewhere. Okay. And what's driving that? What have you found drives that? Because I imagine that has quite a significant impact on well-being, social, emotional, space for teachers, and then there must be a follow-on effect, as you said, as well, for the students as well. But what do you think is driving this change, and is that Australia wide? Is it kind of a bit more global? How does that space look?
It's definitely global. Teachers in every country that I've spoken to are having issues with this. And so it's, many countries are experiencing attrition. They're experiencing teacher shortages because teachers have hit a breaking point. I think the rise in this accountability and compliance has come from a good place. It's come from a place where we're wanting to make sure all students are looked after, all of their needs are met. But as I said, if we don't provide teachers with additional supports, it's just extra work within the same time. So there's unintended consequences of making sure all the administrative work is better looked into, and that has a carry-on effect to teachers.
So the primary forcing function is we want more for our kids, and therefore the demand on teachers is ensuring that they are doing more for each child and a compliance around that and accountability around that. And so it's just becoming overwhelming, I suppose, that more time is now being spent potentially in the recording than it has been previously. Previously, maybe they could actually attend to those needs with a little bit less recording of it.
That's right. And in some ways, like I said, it's good that we have this recording because we want to make sure that we are attending to the needs and children aren't being left behind. But the government requirements, the schooling requirements, also parents' expectations have changed as well. So there is this increased pressure on teachers.
It's interesting, as a parent, I have been absolutely blown away by my children's school, that the volume of communication that they provide us with. And this is all voluntary. Like, it's not like we're a specific set of parents that are asking for anything. This is just going out to, I'm assuming, every parent, from whether an incident has occurred at the school that, your child might come home and talk about this, to, this is how your child is progressing. All this stuff throughout the year, it is a very different experience. Or I should say, I don't feel that that's what my parents received back in the day. Maybe they did, but I maybe I should ask yourself. But there is a lot of communication. Yes, it feels very comfortable as a parent, but I've been surprised because, even in the very early years, you'd get photos of them at preschool or whatever it is, and almost like updates throughout the day. I wasn't expecting anything like that, but to me, that just meant that there needed to be a teacher taking photos, uploading it, putting it into a system, selecting which one, putting the names on them, and all this sort of stuff going on. That clearly meant that it's like that scenario of parents looking at a screen versus potentially attending to their children. But this is a demand. This is almost being required, saying you have to do this, otherwise, I don't know, maybe it's cranky parents or something, or maybe that is one of those accountability or compliance things that is being required. I don't know.
Yes, that's a great point. And it's wonderful when schools can provide that information, because parents want to know how their kids are doing. They want to know what's going on at school. And it's really important to build that home school connection. That's really good for kids. It's really good for families. But as you say, there may be a tipping point where it's becoming an extra job. It's becoming extra workload for teachers that takes away from that core business of teaching. And so we have to find that happy balance between 20 years ago, 30 years ago, very little communication may have gone home, whereas now there's a lot. And maybe the pendulum needs to come back a little bit, particularly if teachers are finding that it's adding time pressure to their work.
And what are some of the costs that you're seeing in your research? What who's getting the short end of the stick, so to speak? Is it both teachers are having a more difficult time? Is it then trickling on to students as well? I know that the world is changing and the like, and I can only speak from an outsider, which means that I'm incredibly poorly informed. So what does the research say? What have your findings and of your colleagues found as well?
So the costs are numerous. You're right. There are costs to students when teachers are not faring well. There are costs to students because if teachers leave, then new teachers need to be brought in, and they take time to learn about the children and what the children need. and they take time to settle into a new classroom. So there's academic costs. There are also social costs because teacher-student relationships are just so critical for students. They help students to be engaged when they feel like they belong within a classroom. They help students to achieve. They help students to experience better well-being. So relationships with teachers are just so critical for students. And so there's that social cost. If teachers quit, then the student has to develop a relationship with a new teacher. There are financial costs. The school has trained someone, has to run professional development, and then they have to do that again with someone, potentially with someone new. And I would go further and say there are also societal costs, because when teachers are, their well-being is suffering, there's extra stress leave. There's lots of costs for health because of the ramifications of burnouts, which can lead to other mental health issues, and physical health as well. So the costs are really broad when we don't look after our teachers. They're really broad.
Mm. Because I never even thought about that in terms of, in particular, the teacher-student relationships that potentially fracture, not because of that there's a damage to the relationship, but that the teacher, moves to another school, or maybe, moves to a different type of role. I never thought about that. And just reflecting now, thinking about the teachers I had, particularly in my high school years, I recall that the teachers we were provided with in year 7 went through all the way to year 10. They were the same teachers, and we forged a very long-term, particularly at that age, it felt like a lifetime, a long-term relationship with those teachers. And I never thought about that. And some became, I think we've all got those experiences, the teachers that we really connected with, those that believed in us, and those that we didn't like. And but yeah, there's an importance of having all of those, but that continuity was, I think, important. And thinking about it as a psychologist, the continuity of care between client and therapist is I think it goes without saying, it's such an important connection. And I never thought about that, actually, the importance of children maintaining those connections, and that could mean whether it's a direct teacher student, or just the teacher in the school that is familiar, that can still touch base and say, hey, how you going, and connect over those formative years.
That's right. And even, as you said, even if they have a different teacher each year, if they know other teachers within the school, it creates that broader sense of belonging. I belong here. People know me. I know my teachers. They say hello to me in the hallway. When I'm out at recess, I know the teachers, and I'm not afraid to go and talk to them or ask for help, because I know them and they know me. Yes, it's so important. It is just critical for learning, because if children are anxious, if they don't feel like they belong, they can't concentrate on what's being taught in the classroom. They're not going to be learning as efficiently. So if people are more concerned about the academic side of things, this actually speaks to that as well. It's not just soft and fluffy. It's actually relevant for the academic outcomes. But on top of that, it's relevant for all the well-being, the social adjustment, and in many important outcomes is just making sure teachers are experiencing well-being so they can build those strong relationships and be connected to every student within their classroom.
And what is it that's lagging in terms of this compliance and accountability? Is that the systems are hard to use, or they are very time intensive, that they require learning things all the time, or it's changing? What have you found? What's kind of like the sticking point? And I asked this because I've recently had a conversation with one of another psychologist here in our practice, and we're talking. His partner is a teacher, and we're talking about just how they do reports. And I was kind of scratching my head, going, it's really odd that we don't have whether it's a national system or at least a state system that says, here's a template. We're in the world of 2023 with all the IT available to us. Yet it seems, and I'm only speaking from the outside because I don't actually know the system, so keeping that in mind, it seems like a tick box system would be much more appropriate with a comment section that would make the process less laborious, because we all know that these things are very repetitive. I mean, all parents, I think, understand that, but there is also value in getting some feedback. But I know it's a hard time for students around that, and that only speaks to one small little section. But is it a system? So is part of the lag systems, IT, how we support teachers in that way? What have your findings been?
Yeah, I think that there's different systems across different schools, across different states. And so some systems work really well. When I was teaching, we had a comments bank. And so we were able to figure out what suited that child most appropriately and then work with these comments from this bank. And so that really helped saving time rather than having to formulate everything for every individual, because it takes time to formulate sentences, right? It takes a lot of time, and so that was very helpful. But it really depends on the school and the system. So yes, IT issues, inefficient systems, definitely part of it. But I think there's also just being more asked of teachers as well. So, Victoria and New South Wales, I'm aware of, are changing policies to try to reduce teachers' workload. They're trying to provide opportunities for less red tape and less paperwork, more time for teaching. And so those policies have just been announced in the last 12 months. And so we're not sure the impact of those, but hopefully this will start to change, because as we know, teachers are leaving in droves. We have a real shortage crisis, and so something does need to change.
And what would your recommendations be? And certainly not necessarily saying as a solution, but as an aid, something that would support the teacher environment. I certainly know if we start thinking about, only speaking about here in the ACT, for psychologists in schools, they're so thinly spread. The demands are about crisis after crisis. They don't get to get their hands dirty into any clinical thing. It's quite, the environment is quite a difficult one, and I think they do an absolutely exceptional job. But I've certainly heard the challenges and pressures that they're under, and how isolating it can be. What would you say are some of the aids or recommendations or considerations that you think you could put forward as things that would aid, support our most precious resource, our teachers?
A lot of it comes down to money, and so funding teachers to have a more planning time. Australian teachers have some of the highest face-to-face teaching hours in the world, and that's great to build those relationships, but it also means they don't have that time for planning, collaborating, coaching with other, building their skills with other teachers. And so they're just always in front of the class, and they don't get that time to reflect as much as teachers in other systems do, in other countries. And so I think giving teachers more time for collaboration, for planning, will ultimately be beneficial for students and teacher wellbeing. Another one, simple things that I've heard schools do, like when you have yard duty. So most teachers will be spending one, probably two half lunches or half recesses out in the yard supervising children, certainly in primary school. And that means there's no break time, because by the time you talk with students as the bell goes, and then you rush out to your yard duty and you come back in. So it's very rushed. The day is very rushed. And so some schools are hiring half staff to get someone else out there, like just a casual person or someone who, build a connection with the school, not just casual random people, but have someone who's out there taking half the jobs of the teachers so that they have more time to do the planning. And even if teachers are often working through their breaks. So, that's something simple. Another strategy I've heard from schools is that when they have sports carnivals, they do the same thing. They pay for half the supervisory teachers to be non-classroom teachers. So those classroom teachers get an extra hour or two of planning. And so there's simple things like that, but it does come down to budget. It all comes down to funding and making sure schools have the funding to give teachers more time.
It's really that's really interesting, because I've always thought, especially in the world of health, psychology, medicine, where professionals can sometimes be underutilized because of, for example, classic admin. And what we're hoping that our specialists do is use their knowledge to provide, wise consult, rather than, sending a fax from one, building to another, because the cost of doing that as a specialist, and let me exaggerate it and say as a surgeon, who's compressed time is incredibly valuable, just doesn't make sense. Sometimes we don't necessarily think about that more broadly, and the importance of, the specialist, i.e. teacher, that they're planning and collaboration with their colleagues and professional development, and even just being able to remove a little bit of the pressure to maintain a good level of consideration and thought, and if I dare say, emotional well-being, so they can be more present in the classroom as well. But it's a hard one, but I can definitely see why money could be useful, or some type of coordination of a regular member that could come into or members, my apologies, they could come into a school, be part of that community, and do a supervisory role. That, more often than not, you're probably only dealing with some really minor things each lunchtime. And it just needs an adult there, but someone that can be obviously trusted and have a little bit of training and the like. But that role, we might be selling teachers a bit short, as a little example.
And I think, as I said, it's good for teachers to be out there, because it is a good chance to build those relationships, but not necessarily 2 to 3 times a week, maybe just once a week, and just cut that down, cut that in half. Yeah.
And I imagine if you said, we're taking that away from teachers, they would probably, some would say, yeah, that's great. Others would say, no, I want to be connected. That's an important part of, being with my students, and not only that, observing them about how they do social play, because there's, once again, a lot to be taught, whether it's about dependency, of not being able to navigate, arguments between, and being guided through that, and so on and so forth. There's a richness at every point. But yeah, I think what you're saying is sounds quite right in terms of the frequency, therefore the load that teachers are therefore under. Any other areas that you could put forward? I know you've obviously spoken with probably countless, teachers and administrators, and looked at the research, and I suppose recommendations come from that. I'm happy to hear about any specific research that you and your team have worked on, that is exciting and can shape the future if it were obviously taken on, and that might also be a challenge about how to integrate the learnings into how do you get schools to adopt this.
Yeah, so we have done, we've looked at these different types of factors. And so you and I have talked about time pressure. That's one that we know is really detrimental for teachers' well-being, and also their retention. We know that if teachers are experiencing time pressure, they're more likely to want to quit their job. So that's one. Another one that we've looked at a lot is principal support. And so we've looked at teachers' perceptions that their principal really trusts them, supports their self-initiative, supports their empowerment as a teacher, their professionalism. And when teachers do feel that sense of support from their school leaders, they report greater well-being. They report that they're less likely to want to quit. They report greater job satisfaction, more commitment to their place of work. And so there are many beneficial outcomes from supportive school leaders. And that's again and again and again, we see that as critical in our research. It's also linked with teacher motivation. We know that when teachers are motivated in the classroom, they do a better job of teaching that curriculum, that content. They use more engaging practices, and so students are more engaged in their learning. And so yes, really supportive school leadership is critical, boosting that, but also reducing that time pressure. And then another one that we've looked at is barriers to professional learning. So in different schools and different locations, there is, a range of professional learning available to teachers, but sometimes it's irrelevant, sometimes it's not very good, sometimes it's not what teachers want, and sometimes teachers can't even access it. For example, teachers in remote locations can really struggle to access professional development that they want and that they need. And so that's another one that we've found is important, giving teachers the professional development that they want, and that helps them to develop as professionals in their context for their students.
Quite significant points there. Can I just clarify one of those? The principal support is what you're talking about, the support that teachers feel from their principal and obviously executive team members, or are we talking about the support that a principal has around them that then has a flow-on effect is the same pressures being applied to principals?
So I'm talking about the former. It's the support that teachers perceive they receive from principals. Sure. But you're absolutely right. Principals are under a lot of pressure as well. School leaders more broadly have top-down pressure and bottom-up pressure. So school leaders are also, their well-being is threatened. There's been lots of research about the state of school leader well-being and how it's quite dire, and it's just the same as teachers. So yes, school principals are someone we also need to look out for.
Is there a difference, and it's a very pointed question, but is there a difference between reported well-being rates among teachers in the primary school setting versus the high school setting? Is there any difference there, or it's felt quite similarly across the board?
It's generally quite similar. I think primary teachers sometimes have higher levels of well-being than secondary teachers, but in other research, there's no difference. So it is very similar.
That's interesting. I would have thought there might be a little bit more of a difference there, just because the settings can be quite different. You're working with obviously more teenagers, kids who are developing in a different time of their life and different, therefore, challenges. Obviously younger persons, children have got their own different complexities, but I thought maybe that would show up differently. Having said that, we're still in a environment of education and all those demands and pressures and parents and the like. How have parents changed over time? Is there a greater demand that's being asked? Is there more pushback? Is there greater accessibility that parents have to teachers now? Has that world sort of shifted or moved? What does it look like?
Yeah, look, it's changed a lot with the advent of email and I mean, in lots of jobs now in countries, there are these right to disconnect clauses where workers are allowed to disconnect after hours. Teachers, in many cases, are working till 11 o'clock, 1 o'clock at night to respond to emails from parents or students, particularly teachers in the later secondary years, so years 11 and 12, it's very hard for teachers to disconnect. In New South Wales, they've just brought in that mobile phone ban, and I think part of that, I've heard anecdotally that part of that they're hoping will help teachers to have that better disconnect between the students and the parents, because students are often texting parents throughout the school day, and fair enough if something is not appropriate, and they're entitled to get in touch with their parents. But I think it can create extra pressure for teachers, because if there's an altercation, for example, by the time they can talk to that student, maybe the parents are already ringing the principal and getting a front foot in. So yes,
Oh, wow.
the relationship between teacher and parent has changed greatly. And I think schools are just starting to recognise we need to make sure teachers do have that time to disconnect, because in any profession, if we don't get a chance to disconnect, we can't be at our best the next day or the next week if we do not get that chance to switch off. So again, if parents are keen for their students to be learning well, this is actually in the interest of students learning as well, because we need teachers to switch off.
I just very recently signed a petition for the ACT government to consider removing mobile phones from classrooms. And my understanding was that ACT is one of the last states in or territories in Australia to look at this. And obviously my position was that I just believe that you become disconnected from the here and the now. You're segmenting your focus, etc. But I also didn't think about the demand that this would, the forcing function of the demand on the school, because every incident has the potential at least to then be immediately relayed to a parent. And then if you have a parent that's not regulating very well, they might ask for information or be concerned. And maybe that's not even fair to say regulating very well, but who might just have parental concern, might be then communicating to the school, asking for more. And so all of a sudden the email rate, the demand just increases. You just do that for an entire year and there's tens of thousands of emails that are just wasted, versus not having that and allowing things to settle and work themselves out in the school setting, which probably is a very healthy thing for a child to develop, rather than being reliant on someone else to do that. But geez, I didn't think of that one. That's a huge one. That's immense.
Yeah, it is. And parents have a right to know what's going on at school, but you raise that important point about letting people calm down, rather than escalating it even more, letting the child calm down, letting the teachers calm down, then discussing it, coming up with solutions, and definitely informing the parents, but it doesn't have to be instantaneous, unless of course it's an emergency, and in that case, absolutely. But yes, there is something to be said for cool heads and letting things settle before we try to resolve them. And so that's a big difference. Like I said, it'll be really interesting to see what it's only been a few weeks that New South Wales has brought in this ban, so it'll be very interesting to see what the feedback is in the new year. Now, the research is mixed on banning mobile phones. So the research is not clear, but as a primary school teacher, from my experience, not from the research, from my experience, yes, gosh, that is just a distraction I would not need in the classroom. I want my kids to be focusing on what we're doing, not, oh, have I got a message, or is there something happening on my phone? Definitely.
Look, I'm no research, but there are certain things that I think are blindly obvious. And it's no different to if you're on a first date and you're on your phone, how's that person receiving you if you're attending to your phone versus them? So on purely a emotional and human connection, if you're doing the same in any setting, we know that you can't split your attention. The data is very, very clear about multitasking. It doesn't exist. Your cognitive faculties are broken, hence why you're not allowed to text and drive. Two things that we can do very easily, one at a time. and to go out and put all of this additional layer in a classroom, I think if the research said there was no difference, I'd be questioning the research and saying, not that I'm a researcher, not that I know the statistics, but I would say the statistics must be broken. They've pulled out some nonsense statistical equation that isn't. At least I'd be questioning it and wanting someone who knows what they're talking about to look at it, because that just doesn't stack up. It doesn't mean that there isn't some aids and some value. Of course there is. There's pros and cons. That is just across the board for everything. But if we're trying to say just attending and being present, which is what we want kids to do, at least I believe, just attend and be present and learn from that environment. That's why we're creating that. Kids have got plenty of access to phones and the rest of it for their entire life. It's not like you're missing out. Your thumbs will work out how to use those pads, and we won't be doing that very soon either. We'll figure out other ways. But I'm pretty passionate about that space, because I'm concerned about what opportunities are being lost or the potential harms that are being the opportunities for harm that are coming up from that I think might outweigh the benefits of being connected, because I think you're still connected in the classroom and you're still connected in the playground. It's not like the connection's gone because your phone's not there.
Yeah, and I think from hearing from teachers, they say the schoolyard is a totally different place with phones banned. Kids are chatting, they're playing games, they're doing all of those activities that we want them to be doing, rather than just sitting there on their phones, looking at their phones. So socially, I think it's actually a really good thing at recess. I think the advocates, and I may get this wrong, but from what I understand, I think the advocates are saying phones can be used in particular exercises. For example, if they're doing something in science and they want to use an app, that can be a really good opportunity. So if it's specific use for a specific purpose, then it can be good. But yes, if they're being distracted, no one can argue that that's a good thing. We don't want children to be playing Candy Crush while they're in their maths lesson. We just don't. So yeah.
Yeah, and I, even in this petition, I remember specifically writing about, it should devices used as teaching aids. Absolutely. As a matter of fact, we want to encourage as much of that, because they're going to be on platforms. They're going to be on screens. I mean, the rest of us are. So why would we think that that's not going to be the case for our kids? It's the communication side. And obviously there's good communication. There's not so good. And, locking down one at the moment is impossible. You can't just say you've got a device and it only does this. That's not true. But at the same time, I do know, for example, my experience very recently, in actual fact, was rather than that loop that you were talking about where an incident happens at school and that might be, shared with 10% of the parents, and maybe, 2% of the 10 might communicate with the school to get more information. As a parent, I received a notification saying X occurred at school. Your kids might want to speak about this, and it was a nearby fire in the neighborhood, and so that's a point of excitement for kids. But that was one text message by one staff member that told all parents. It's like that is elegant and wonderful. It's informative. It pumps the brakes because it's got good language in it, and it means that parents can feel like they're part of a community, they're part of the school. That connection is there. They're not alarmed. It came from an adult, at reasonable timing, and we can actually inquire about it, which makes it interesting for dinner time conversation as well. I think a beautiful use of resources and the efficiency, rather than the concern that maybe individual teachers would receive from individual parents, or multiples. So it's trying to understand those forcing functions, I think, and it's a difficult space for teachers. The world is changing.
It is a difficult space, and yes, that's a great example of fulfilling that duty of care, letting parents know what happened, but doing so in a calm manner. when, so that it doesn't drum up all of this emotion and stress, and then parents get student stress because they're texting back and forth and texting, a whole bunch of parents. It's not good for teachers, it's not good for parents, it's not good for students. So finding that right type of communication is really important to build those homeschool connections. But as you say, it's difficult, it's complex.
One other item I wanted to pick your brain on is I find it difficult to gauge what our education system looks like for the students in terms of what are the outcomes. I feel like kids these days are incredibly well educated. They are being provided so many opportunities. The teaching styles have changed. There's a lot more collaboration and conversation and inquiry and about what something means. And so it seems like it's a bit more abstract so it's developing more abstract thinking and developing more healthy skepticism, if I can call it that, in terms of questioning things. And I feel, at least from my experience, and I can only talk about, one kid going through a single school, with those particular teachers. So it's not what I felt wasn't representative of the whole of Australia. But I just feel like there's been a huge shift. Has that eventuated into any data that's showing that kids are brighter than their parents, that in terms of or more insightful or more rounded, or are they more emotionally stable? Like, what is there a better product that's coming out of our schools today than it was 30 years ago?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. I mean, it's hard so I don't know any data in education that focuses on that, but I do know that with IQ testing, for example, intelligence testing, they have to continually update and make the tests harder over the past 50 years, 100 years, because people are getting smarter and better at these abstract tasks. So that's something that kind of speaks to what you're saying. In terms of, our performance for our students, I mean, we have those multinational assessments, like the Program for International Student Assessment, which is run by the OECD. Australia is doing okay, but I think we've tended to go down over the past decade. But you have to consider that in relation to the fact that other systems may be going up. So it could be just a relative decline rather necessarily than an absolute decline. And there are other people who do research specifically into that. So it's not something that I conduct research on. What I more look at is what factors in the school, from the teachers' support, for example, and school factors and learning factors help to predict greater achievement among individual students. And so from that, we know things like social adjustment, the ability to social emotional skills, for example, great teacher support. So that's, building those strong relationships, providing that instrumental support for what students need, having good classroom management skills, good, making sure the classroom is quiet when it needs to be quiet, ensuring students are on task. Those types of teaching practices we know are linked with these positive outcomes among students.
And how are those things reinforced in schools? Like, obviously all teachers go through university, they do their training. How is professional development usually delivered? Are there those opportunities to rub shoulders, to learn from, maybe the juniors to the seniors, or vice versa, or just rubbing shoulders with colleagues to steal their tips and tricks and take on some of their language? I'm always fascinated when I go to my children's assemblies and just watching how the teachers are able to, I'll use the word command, but it's not command, it's influence and nurture and guide how all the the kids play a role, and the assembly is like student led. So it scratches my head because I don't recall that ever being the case at my school. Nothing was student led, but here we are. We got students leading it, and it's going swimmingly. It's phenomenal. But how are those skills developed? For teachers, how are they supported? How does it usually occur, and what are some of the pitfalls?
So I'll start with the pitfalls. Often teachers, and I kind of mentioned this before, often teachers will say that the professional learning they have access to isn't very good. It's not actually what they need or want. And so there has been research conducted showing that professional learning to be effective needs to be focused on teachers' goals, it needs to be ongoing, it needs to be relevant to their context. And ideally, when teachers can work together and coach each other and mentor each other to develop in a particular area, that can be very powerful. So that's often called a professional learning community. And so those are some what we know are factors about effective professional learning. But there's also, like you mentioned, in-school coaching, teachers observing each other's classroom, learning from each other. That requires time. And so depending on the school, the system, teachers have more or less time to do that. It also requires a psychologically safe space to do that. Teachers need to feel safe to be observed, to receive critical feedback or constructive feedback. And teachers also need to feel safe to be able to give that feedback. So it does take creating an environment of professional growth to be able to effectively work in those types of mentoring or coaching opportunities. But yes, peer observation, there's good support for that in terms of the research. When teachers are able to observe their peers, learn from it, reflect on what they've learned, reflect on how they could implement it, that can be really beneficial for their ongoing practice development.
Are there any specific Department of Education process that must be or guidelines that must be followed, or each school does it by themselves? For example, as you know, in psychology, it's kind of like do your PD and this is how many hours you need to do and off you go, versus something that I think would be amazing is if there was a rule which said you have to do X amount of sessions that shadow a colleague, so that it kind of forces the function of observing someone else being observed, because we know that people will learn in those. You'll hear a very different approach. You'll hear a very different skill set. You will make sure you're following protocol a lot more effectively and the like. You'd probably get lots of pushback, I'm sure, because we'd all kick and scream. Even though we're adults, we'd still kick and scream on that one. But it would be, I think, fantastic professional development. Is it similar with teaching? It's like you need to do professional development hours, but it's kind of open slather, or is it a little bit more structured? Or is it like each school just does their own, and however the principal and executives and the school initiative kind of does it per school?
Yeah, usually it's more like that. It's more each school to their own, but there are accredited professional development courses. So teachers do have to do a certain number of hours. And I mean, there's more structure when teachers are beginning and they have to get their initial accreditation as teacher. So it changes depending on what career stage, depending on what system you're working in as well. But yes, it is really beneficial to observe other people and learn from what others are doing. You can learn so much from hearing about others' experiences.
Rebecca, I could talk for absolute hours on this and think about how we can improve our system, which I genuinely think is absolutely fantastic. And I think that our teachers are amazing, and I think we're producing unbelievable students. So I think they're all positives, but yeah, I think we're a good, healthy society also continues to say, how do we do it better? How do we improve on this? And by that mean we've got to go out and question, things like compliance and accountability, and are they actually adding or are they beginning to subtract? Where's that tipping point? And similarly, we could ask the same question about professional development and how that's laid out. So absolutely, a pleasure speaking to you. How can people find out more? How can people find out more about you, your work? How could they get involved in the type of research that you do? I know that you've written, an absolute plethora of articles and a book and so on and so forth. How can we find out more?
I think probably the best way to access the ongoing research is through LinkedIn. So if you look up my name on LinkedIn, you can find me, and that's where I post all the new studies. We also try often disseminate our research through online magazines for teachers, things like places like The Conversation as well, and so they're more accessible than the journal articles, which can be a dense read at times. So that's probably the best place because, as I said, everything I do is shared on that.
And do you recall your how to find you on LinkedIn? Because I
think it's just Rebecca Collie. I think that's my my handle. Yep.
And from UNSW.
Yes. So if you look at the UNSW website too, you can see a list of all the publications that's updated regularly as well. But LinkedIn is more immediate. I think that's really the best way to access the ongoing work.
Yeah, fantastic. Once again, Rebecca, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast today and your insights. And I hope that as a community, we can use your insights, research, and like to promote a better schooling system and experience for both teachers and parents. And I'd have to say, therefore, so teachers and students, and I therefore have to say parents as well. I mean, it's one big community, and I don't think we appreciate that when we're kids. But as we go into adults and parents, we recognise the value that that school home connection. I've never heard that term before, but I think that's absolutely such a beautiful term to consider, that those two worlds not only connecting but overlapping, and the value of that. So thank you so much, and all the best with your ongoing research as well.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on today to chat.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please support it by going to iTunes and putting a review, subscribe, share it via social media, and tell others about it. Start a conversation. It's listeners like you that make this able and possible, and why we bring in these guests to go out and share their knowledge and resources. And just lastly, if you are a psychologist and you want to go out and be part of a bigger team, develop your experience and get into some exciting work, come to strategicpsychology.com.au/careers and reach out. I'd love to hear from you.